is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello there, I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories this hour. Ukraine's president pleads for more security guarantees and entry to NATO at a European leaders' summit in Moldova. Russian assaults on Kiev continue as the Kremlin accuses Ukraine of increased shelling on their side of the border. And the US debt ceiling bill races to the Senate after being passed in the House, just days out from a potential catastrophic default. President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged European leaders to put concrete security guarantees in place for Ukraine and its neighbour Moldova to provide protection against Russia. Zelensky's plea came at the start of a summit near the Moldovan capital Chisinau. He demanded a clear decision on Ukraine's entry to NATO and also reiterated calls for fighter jets. European leaders are using the occasion as a symbolic show of support for Ukraine and Moldova, while also tackling other issues, including a spike in ethnic tensions in northern Kosovo. Let's go live now to Alex Cadier, our correspondent in Chisinau for us. So, how significant is this meeting for Moldova, and what's the latest from President Zelensky?
Well, Paul, it's very significant for Moldova. It's a very high-profile, really important meeting for this country. It's one of the poorest countries in Europe, and you can imagine seeing those 45 heads of state and government coming to this country for this one-day meeting will have huge symbolic importance and will also show the people of this country that they are being seen, they are being heard, and that they matter in a way that hasn't necessarily been shown in the past. So for President Maia Sandu, this is a big win. This is a big message of European support for this country. It is part of a battle of sphere of influences between Russia, which has been very influential in this region for more than a century, and the European Union making overtures and making efforts to reach out and to build that proximity and build that relationship. That cooperation, a big part of what's being discussed at this summit, cooperation on security issues. We know the European Union is helping Moldova boost its defense and security by offering millions of euros in funding, and also cooperation on energy. Russia has reduced the supply of gas to Moldova since the start of the invasion of Ukraine. And that has cost people in this country, in this city, a lot. Their bills increased significantly, and for a country where the economy isn't necessarily where it could be, that will have had a really serious impact. So that ability to meet with European leaders, get their support, meet, for example, with the Prime Minister of Norway, who is also here despite not being an EU member state, a big energy producer, maybe a discussion there with the President of Moldova. So very significant for the President of Moldova, building that cooperation, but also very significant for President Zelensky. He was the first leader to arrive this morning and made some very clear signals about his desire for his country to join NATO as soon as possible and the EU as soon as possible. Let's have a listen to what he said.
What is very important, our future in EU, and Ukraine is ready to be in NATO. We are waiting when NATO will be ready to host and to have Ukraine. And I think security guarantees are very important, not only for Ukraine, for our neighbors, for Moldova, because of the Russia and of their aggression in Ukraine and potential aggression for other parts of Europe.
Alex, the sudden upsurge in violence in the Balkans has also been causing alarm among EU states.
Yeah, that's right. And it's also this meeting is about a show of unity across the continent, a show of unity between those EU 27 member states and the non-EU European countries, and divisions within those blocs, division within the continent, tensions between Serbia and Kosovo go against that show of unity. We've heard from the Kosovan side saying that Serbia's non-recognition of Kosovo is part of the problem, is a threat to Kosovo, also calling for a de-escalation of violence. The Serbian President Vučić saying he will do what he can to de-escalate that violence. But we've seen NATO and the European Union condemning that violence, NATO in particular calling the violence against its troops with a UN mandate in that region as completely unacceptable. So that division is also quite a clear sign of the challenges ahead for those Western Balkan countries, countries like Serbia and Kosovo, if they were to get closer to the European Union, if they were to join the European Union, as so many of them want to do. These tensions have to be resolved before that happens, because if it doesn't, it can then become a problem for the whole Union. So something that is very much front of mind, including front of mind for Josep Borrell, the EU's chief diplomat. He spoke about this a little bit earlier. Let's have a listen.
Kosovo and Serbia. Look, yes, I expect to have a meeting with President Vučić. Yesterday I met Prime Minister Kurti. So we have to insist that the violence is not the way. That violence has to be condemned. And the perpetrators of this violence has to be accountable. And everybody has to try to avoid any kind of escalation and uncoordinated moves.
So divisions, avoiding escalation are really part of the conversations at this meeting, but certainly the desire from those European leaders is a show of unity. This is the second time only that these countries, all 45, have met together in the same place. In Moldova, that very strong symbolism. So some divisions to be sure, but the fact is these leaders are in the room, are together, are getting together to have these discussions in what Europe hopes will be a very strong show of unity.
Alex Cadier in Moldova, thank you very much. Well, NATO foreign ministers are meeting in Norway as discussions continue over Ukraine and Sweden entering the alliance. They have been joined in Oslo by the Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström, who urged Turkey and Hungary to greenlight his country's accession. Both nations are currently blocking Stockholm's bid. Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says he will travel to the Turkish capital soon for further negotiations.
Sweden is now integrating more and more into NATO structures, our military structures, our civilian structures, and several allies also provided bilateral security assurances for Sweden. So it's absolutely inconceivable that there will be any threat or any attack against Sweden without NATO reacting. I will travel to Ankara in the near future, exactly when is not yet decided.
Ukraine says at least 3 people, including 2 children, have been killed in Russia's latest missile attack on the capital, Kyiv. A 9-year-old girl and her mother, another woman died when a rocket fell, or the debris fell, near an air raid shelter that they've been trying to enter. Ukraine said it shot down 10 ballistic and cruise missiles in Russia's 18th attack on the capital since the start of May. Russia says it has repelled more cross-border attacks in its western region of Belgorod, accusing pro-Ukrainian forces of carrying out attempted raids. Kyiv has denied involvement. This, the Belgorod governor says, has prompted a partial evacuation of civilians from the area. Well, Stuart Smith, our correspondent in Moscow, joins us now. So, Stuart, a lot of focus on the Belgorod region at the moment. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, in the past 24 hours, there has been frequent shelling reported by local governors in Belgorod. And then in the early hours of this morning here in Russia, there was another attempt at a cross-border incursion. According to the Russian Federal Security Service and the MOD, that was successfully thwarted. That this time the raiders didn't cross over Russian territory. And as he was saying, it was once again claimed by the Free Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps, self-styled fighters who are based in Ukraine but say they are all Russian and Belarusian citizens trying to, quote, free Russia from the current, quote, regime. Now, this time they haven't commented on how far they got, but they do appear not to have made it as far as the previous raid that happened earlier in May. The shelling, though, is far more frequent. These cross-border raids are very uncommon, although they do seem to be increasing in frequency. The shelling and the drone attacks do seem to be increasing, and Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, said that he is working with local governors to try to arrange for civilians to move away from their homes if they believe they are in danger and they would like to move. From the latest we've heard from the Belgorod regional governor, hundreds of children and women and the elderly have been moved from their homes, and evacuations may continue after this most intense period of fighting has finished.
And Stuart, there's talk of Russian President Vladimir Putin introducing martial law nationwide. What more have you heard?
Yeah, we've not heard about claims martial law might be applied for a while now, and the only reason this is now being discussed again is because of comments from Ramzan Kadyrov, the governor of Chechnya, a region in Russia, but a region with a lot of autonomy and with a leader who's very keen on making public statements about the so-called special military operation. He suggested that because of what he described as Ukrainian terror attacks, now was the time for martial law. Now, in response to that, the Kremlin hit back. Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary, said that such a decision about martial law is fully and entirely the prerogative of the Supreme Federal Authority. There are no discussions, he says, about this, and no decisions about martial law have been made. At the same time, these regions closer to Ukraine, just like Belgorod, do have a degree of extra powers due to the situation. They're currently on a medium alert, which means local governors can evacuate residents, can impose transport and movement restrictions, and also can assist the Russian military if they feel it is required.
Stuart Smith in Moscow, thanks for that. And in other news, rockets have struck a market in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, killing at least 19 people. More than 100 others were injured in the latest fighting between Sudan's army and the rival paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. It's the most civilian casualties in a single incident in the capital since the conflict began in April, and comes as ceasefire talks brokered by the United States and Saudi Arabia collapsed. One of Australia's most decorated soldiers has lost a defamation case against 3 newspapers who accused him of war crimes in Afghanistan. Ben Roberts-Smith sued the papers after they alleged he was involved in the murders of unarmed civilians while on deployment. The judge said 4 of the 6 allegations were substantially true, a ruling that was welcomed by the newspaper journalists.
Today is a day of justice. It's a day of justice for those brave men of the SAS who stood up and told the truth about who Ben Roberts-Smith is. A war criminal, a bully and a liar. Australia should be proud of those men in the SAS. They are the majority in the SAS, and they stood up for what was right, and they have been vindicated. Today is a day of some small justice for the Afghan victims of Ben Roberts-Smith.
You're watching CGTN, still to come. On World Milk Day, find out how the traditional dairy industry faces new challenges from plant-based alternatives.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Hello there, welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. Ukraine's president pleads for more security guarantees and entry to NATO at a European leaders summit in Moldova. Russian assaults on Kiev continue as the Kremlin accuses Ukraine of increased shelling on their side of the border. US Senate leaders are aiming for quick passage of a bill to lift the government's $1 trillion debt ceiling just days out from a potential catastrophic default. It cleared the first hurdle on Wednesday as the House of Representatives passed the bill. If it clears the Senate, it will be sent to President Joe Biden to sign, ahead of the June 5th deadline when the federal government is expected to run out of money to pay its bills. Let's talk now to our correspondent, John Terrett, live from New York. So, John, the House passed this bill with a vote of 314 to 117. When we were talking on the show yesterday, you were saying this wasn't going to be a surefire win for McCarthy.
No, it was touch and go to the very last minute. We simply did not know. And this follows weeks of rancor and argument and television coverage with unhappiness from both sides of the House, the progressive left and the ultra right. But you're correct. In the end, the vote did go ahead at about 9 o'clock local time. It was about sort of 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning in Europe, and it was overwhelmingly in favor, as you say, 314 votes in favor, 117 against. So it has passed, but there are two big questions still outstanding. Now, one of them is about Kevin McCarthy. He is the most senior Republican in the country at the moment until somebody gets the nomination for the 2024 presidential election. He's the man in the crosshairs. He's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And certainly right now, he's absolutely cock-a-hoop about what happened. He's very, very pleased indeed. However, it did take 15 rounds of voting earlier this year to get him into that position. And one of the provisos that he got the job was that any member of his caucus can call for what's called a motion to vacate, which means there would be a vote on him potentially losing his job. And the problem is that more Democrats last night voted in the House for that bill than did the Republican caucus. Indeed, very many Republicans voted against it. And that could be a problem going forward for Kevin McCarthy. Nonetheless, last week, he said that of all his days in the House, yesterday was the best. Take a listen.
For the first time in quite some time, we'd spend less than we spent the year before. Tonight, we all made history, because this is the biggest cut and savings this Congress has ever voted for.
And now it moves on to the great debating chamber, the Senate. They actually got the piece of paper that gave them permission to go ahead and start debating within minutes, actually, of that vote last night. Somebody literally ran down the corridor and gave it to them. They were still in session. But they've yet to turn their attention to it. And we're going to have to see what happens in the Senate, because, Paul, I'm afraid the Senate is quite capable of its own drama. And in the meantime, the clock is ticking down towards Monday.
So about that, with senators uncertain about which way they're going to go, are the markets breathing a sigh of relief, or could the vote still be keeping people on their toes?
No, on their toes, I'm afraid. Wall Street thinks it knows how this drama ends. And I think it probably does, which is, you know, the princess gets her handsome prince at the end, everybody kisses and makes up, and everyone's happy. And we know this because this is what happened in 2011 and again in 2013. The stock markets are pretty happy with things. The bond market has been much more edgy. Traditionally, the dollar strengthens by about 2% when they sign these deals, so we'll see what happens once it is signed, probably next week. But the problem here is that in the Senate, there are now very strong reports of people who are unhappy with this bill on both sides, progressive left, ultra right, determined to delay its passage through the Senate. We've already heard this morning from senators in Utah and in Vermont, in the northwest and the northeast of the country, very, very unhappy with what is actually in this bill that passed the House yesterday. And there's talk about amendments being added in the Senate. Now, if they do that, it's got to go back to the House. So you can see this is why I keep talking about we're probably not looking until the end of the weekend before we actually get this sorted out. I mean, Monday could be a very volatile day indeed if they're still talking and we're still in this situation. At the moment, the Dow is down 72 points. That's better than it was an hour ago when it was down 200. NASDAQ and S&P are both flat, and that is because they are not sure what's going to happen in the Senate. And we have the jobs report coming out tomorrow, Friday. Paul.
Well, we'll get the latest on that with you tomorrow. Thanks so much, John. John Terrett there in New York. Well, the US commercial real estate market is facing a potential crisis. For the first time in more than a decade, prices fell in the first quarter of this year. The pandemic has had a significant impact on the sector, with remote working embraced by many companies. It could also have a costly spillover effect on the banking industry, responsible for trillions of dollars of loans. Our correspondent Benji Hire explains.
The 9 to 5, the commute, The office. Is it all a thing of the past? More people are returning to the workplace, but coronavirus has changed the game. And the economic effect of the pandemic is sending commercial real estate prices down by almost 1%.
You have elevated interest rates. You know, the Fed basically hiked rates from 0 to 5% in a very short period of time. Those elevated interest rates put downward pressure on commercial real estate prices. I think on top of that, we've got some of these longer term, I'll call them structural changes right now, particularly around working from home. So you've got more and more folks who are spending time at home, and as a result, they're not spending as much time in the office and in the associated sort of spending environments, all of which tend to be really prime locations for commercial real estate.
And analysts suggest those longer-term trends are likely to persist for the next decade.
It would not be surprising to me if you had properties that were based in city centers close down over time, and eventually things would be built more in the suburbs and exurbs.
Bad news for the banks. That's because they account for nearly 2/3 of the $3.6 trillion in outstanding commercial real estate loans. Smaller institutions are left particularly exposed at a time when several have already collapsed under the strain of interest rates. Further rate rises to counter inflation could make it even harder to retain deposits and would push up the cost of loan repayments.
So property owners are looking elsewhere for a solution. With more students than space at some colleges, their answer could lie here.
Universities are expressing an interest in leasing office spaces, since they want to bring back to the class the students, and with providing an office space like a space that is very close to what it is like in the office space with high ceilings, this can bring like more students back to the class.
Yet, as office blocks across the country remain empty, construction of commercial space is still on the rise. The hope that the sector can build back from the brink. Benji Haya, CGTN, Washington, D.C.
Uganda's president has defended his country's new anti-LGBTQ laws despite threats of cuts to aid by donor nations. Earlier this week, Kampala passed some of the harshest anti-gay laws in the world, with punishments including the death penalty for same-sex acts. The US is among the donors to suggest it could review donations to Uganda in light of the new legislation. But President Yoweri Museveni says his country will rearrange budgets rather than back down on the plans. A Nepali Sherpa has saved a Malaysian climber on the world's highest mountain in a rare high-altitude rescue. The man was found clinging to a rope and shivering below the summit of Mount Chongmalangma in an area known as the Death Zone, where temperatures can drop to -30 degrees or even lower. The Sherpa hauled him back down 600 metres for over 6 hours. A helicopter using a long line then lifted the climber back to the Everest base camp. Meanwhile, Nepalese mountaineer and guide Tenzin Sherpa has criticised climbers over the amount of rubbish left at camps on Mount Chongmalangma. In a series of social media posts, he said he was appalled at the piles of trash littered outside tents, including steel bowls, spoons and even sanitary pads. He called on authorities to intervene and punish the camping companies responsible for causing the mess. Well, this Thursday is World Milk Day, when the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization celebrates the dairy sector. It comes at a time, though, when the industry is facing a new challenge with the soaring popularity of plant-based alternatives. Charlotte Parsons reports.
5 a.m. in London. No sound but the birds. No one on the streets but the milkman.
We deliver all types, from your regular full cream, semi-skimmed, skimmed. We also do organic milk, again, same varieties.
Peter Bircham has been doing this job for 40 years. The British milkman with his traditional glass bottles has been around for nearly a century and a half, a rare constant in a fast-changing world. But change is coming to the dairy industry as concerns over health, animal rights and the environment fuel a rise in sales of non-dairy milk substitutes. And nowhere is this change more apparent than in places like this. It used to be that when a barista asked you what kind of milk you wanted in your latte, they meant full fat or skimmed. Today, they're offering almond or oat, soy or coconut, and more people are choosing those options.
Roughly about 5 people out of 10 ask for dairy-free alternatives. And if you compare with around 3 to 5 years ago, it has increased quite a lot, as probably about 1 in 10 people used to order dairy-free alternatives.
Nearly half of British adults consume plant-based alternatives as part of their diet, drinking $125 million worth of them in a year. And that number looks set to rise. 46% of Brits say they're thinking about reducing their intake of animal products in the near future. But that doesn't mean cow's milk is being put out to pasture just yet. 52% of people still consume it.
Obviously, breeding of cows isn't exactly the best for our environment, so yeah, I sort of switched to oat milk about 2 years ago.
My grandson who lives with us, he has almond milk, so we have to get that for him, but I'm one of the old school and I just use semi-skim milk.
I like coconut when you're doing the hot chocolate, but other than that, oat for sure.
One of milk's main advantages over its new rivals is price. It remains the cheapest choice. But the gap isn't as big as it used to be. The price of milk has risen 35% in the past year, while the price of alternatives rose more slowly. As plant-based products fill shelves that were once the exclusive domain of milk, a war over words has broken out. Dairy groups are calling for the likes of almond milk, plant-based yogurt and vegan cheese to be renamed so consumers don't mistake them for dairy products. The EU has rejected that argument, but the UK is considering it right now. Back on the streets of London, Peter isn't worried about plant products or their names. Although his dairy recently began offering oat and coconut milk directly to coffee shops, he believes cow's milk is here to stay. Charlotte Parsons, CGTN, London.
And our headlines again. Ukraine's president pleads for more security guarantees and entry to NATO at a European leaders' summit in Moldova. Russian assaults, meanwhile, on Kiev continue as the Kremlin accuses Ukraine of increased shelling on their side of the border. And the US debt ceiling bill races to the Senate after being passed in the House just days out from a potential catastrophic default. And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. There's more on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or you can scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent to your phone. We'll have more news at the top of the hour. Up next, it's World Insight with Tian Wei. Bye for now.
Hi there and welcome to weather forecast over to Europe. Under influence of low pressure systems, we're going to have a wide range of light rainfall over the next 2 days across the majority of the continent. Very likely to have some thunderstorms in southern Europe all the way stretching to western Russia. Looking to Saturday, you're going to have very similar conditions. Also still lowering chances to be had in much of Ireland, UK, all the way down to northern France, majority of Germany and Poland. The persistent rainfall will also usher in some cooler temperatures, especially if you're living in the central portion, Eastern Europe, all the way down to Balkans next 2 days. Daily highs may drop by around 10 degrees Celsius. So take a closer look at a city forecast. We're going to have 17 for day highs in Copenhagen, partly sunny sky. Overnight rainfall, same number in the city of Stockholm. But weather conditions taking place in Helsinki all the way to Moscow, down to Kiev. You can see clearing conditions with daily highs around 22. Well, back to western portion, you're going to have 23 for day highs in London. A bit warmer conditions to be had in the city of Paris, 27. Down to Madrid and Lisbon, you're going to have day highs around 25. A chance of light rainfall. Well, that's it for now. Stay tuned for more city forecast.